I've been living in a pretty safe city in Scotland for about 4 years now. But even so, I've had my fair share of unsettling encounters. I'm a 29-year-old woman, about 5'3", and I work in a pub. It's a great job, but it means I often head home really late, especially on weekends. Sometimes as late as 2 a.m. I've always been careful on those walks home. No headphones, staying alert, sticking to well-lit areas. That night was no different. I locked up the pub, said goodbye to my co-worker, and headed out into the cold night air. The quickest way home takes me across a grocery store car park. It's well lit and usually quiet, but that night, something just felt off. There were a couple of cars parked there, nothing unusual, but something about the scene made me uneasy. I glanced over my shoulder and spotted a man in a hat walking some distance behind me. He wasn't close enough to be alarming, but he caught my attention. Something about his presence put me on edge. I left the car park and started walking along the main road that leads to my flat, a good mile away. A couple of minutes later, I looked over my shoulder again. The guy was still there, walking the same direction, and the gap between us was closing. That's when I decided to cross the road. I told myself it wasn't because of him. I usually crossed there anyway, but I made sure to check on his position as I went. Once across, I didn't look back for a while, assuming he'd stayed on the other side. But then I started to hear footsteps getting closer. My stomach dropped. A quick glance confirmed it. He was about 20 feet behind me, now on my side of the road. My heart was pounding, but I didn't want to panic. I reached into my bag and grabbed the glass soda bottle I'd been carrying, just in case. A few seconds later, he was close enough to speak. "Hello?" he said, his voice casual but deliberate. "How are you?" I didn't answer. Over the years, I've learned that being polite isn't worth risking my safety, especially if something feels off. But he didn't take the hint. "Are you going to work?" he asked. "No," I said shortly. "Are you going home?" he pressed. "Yes." My tone was cold. I wasn't interested in chatting, but he wouldn't let up. "Do you live in this direction? Do you live off this road? Where do you live? Do you live close by?" I glared at him, but didn't answer. I slowed my pace, hoping he'd move on. Instead, he slowed too, trying to match me. The tension was unbearable. After a moment, he walked ahead, but not far, maybe 300 yards. Then he stopped, turned around, and just stared. He was waiting for me. That's when I tried to grab my phone. Of course, it was dead. Just my luck. I cursed the dodgy battery under my breath and gripped the bottle tighter. Surprisingly, though, I didn't feel afraid, just focused. I knew I had to lose him. As he started walking again, I noticed a narrow path leading to a block of flats. Tall hedges obscured it from view. Without thinking, I darted behind the hedges and crouched low. My heart was racing, but I stayed still, clutching the bottle and listening for his footsteps. The minutes crawled by. After about 10 minutes, I peeked out from my hiding spot. No sign of him. I checked every shadow, every bus stop, every possible place he could be lying in wait. Nothing. I'd lost him. Walking the rest of the way home, I couldn't shake the unease. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe he was just trying to make conversation. But if you see a woman walking alone at night, and she clearly looks uncomfortable, don't talk to her. Definitely don't ask her where she lives. It doesn't help, and it doesn't feel harmless. To this day, I don't know what that man's intentions were. I wasn't drunk. I didn't look like I needed help. I was just walking home like I always do. But I can't imagine anything good coming from his behavior. I'm just glad I trusted my instincts and didn't stick around to find out. About 2 years ago, I had one of the scariest experiences of my life. I live in a farming area with lots of fields and woodlands, perfect for walking my dogs off lead. That evening, I completely forgot to take them out until about 8:30. It was October, so it was already pitch dark by then, but I wasn't too worried. I know the area like the back of my hand. I decided to take my 2 dogs, a large boxer puppy who was already fully grown in height and ridiculously muscular, and my little Chihuahua Jack Russell mix. I'm a 5'5" girl with a fair bit of muscle from doing martial arts and other sports, so I felt like I could handle myself. Thinking I didn't need a torch, I grabbed my headphones, cranked up some heavy metal, and set off. I headed out of my estate and up a hill that leads to another neighborhood bordering the fields. It was eerily quiet. No traffic, no people. For a well-populated area, it felt unusually deserted. Still, I shrugged it off and kept walking. My little mutt was excited, nipping at the lead while my boxer tried to attack her own shadow, as boxers do. When we reached the fields, it was almost total darkness. There were no streetlights, just the faint glow of houses in the distance. I let my boxer off her lead, and she bounded into the tall grass like a maniac, while my little mutt stuck close to my heels, occasionally nipping my jeans for attention. After about 5 minutes, my eyes adjusted to the dim light. That's when I noticed my boxer had stopped dead, staring at something up ahead. Almost at the same time, my little dog started growling and pressed against my legs protectively. I followed their gaze and froze. About 3 meters ahead of me was a figure. I called my boxer back, thinking maybe it was just someone out for a walk. She hesitated, but eventually trotted back toward me. I kept my eyes on the figure as I called out, "Sorry about that. She's just a puppy and thinks everyone wants to play." No response. The figure just stood there, completely silent. Now that my boxer was beside me, I could make out more details. The person appeared to have long hair and was wearing a raincoat. The shoulders were broad, but something about their stance made me think it might be a woman. I called out again. "Are you okay? Did she jump up on you?" Still nothing. Just silence. And then I felt it. Her eyes on me and my dogs. Suddenly, my little dog started barking and squealing, and my boxer let out this deep, guttural bark I'd never heard from her before. It was like she was trying to warn the figure off, and then the person started laughing. But it wasn't normal laughter. It was this horrible, malevolent cackle that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I scooped up my little dog and ran, knowing my boxer would follow. I sprinted toward the gate at the edge of the field, my heart pounding in my chest. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the figure had started running too, full on chasing us. I only caught a glimpse of her in the moonlight, but what I saw was straight out of a horror film. Her face was grotesque, twisted into an unnatural expression. My boxer, bless her, stayed right by my side. She could have easily outpaced me, but she matched my speed, like she knew I needed her there. I reached the gate, jumped over it with my little dog in my arms, and glanced back. She was still coming, though she was a good distance behind us. My brain was in overdrive, trying to figure out what to do next. If I took the same route back to the estate, she'd catch up. So I darted left, down a road that led to another street. My boxer stayed beside me, and my little mutt clung to me like his life depended on it. I sprinted through the empty streets, taking sharp turns whenever I could to lose her. Finally, I reached the entrance to my estate. My driveway was in sight. I didn't dare look back until I reached my front door. I put my mutt down, and he ran with my boxer straight to the door. When I turned around, she was gone. But then I heard it. Her laughter, echoing in the distance. I bolted inside, slammed the door, and locked it. Turning off the porch light, I peeked through the little window in the door. A few moments later, I saw her. She walked right past my driveway, her head turning slightly, scanning the area. She hadn't seen me. Once she was gone, I told my older sister what had happened. She agreed we shouldn't tell our dad. He'd never let me walk the dogs alone again. That night stuck with me. I never walk my dogs after dark anymore. If I forget, I wait until morning. To this day, I don't know what her intentions were, but I know they weren't good. This story happened at my workplace, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. I work in the cosmetics department of a pharmacy. To give you some context, our department is right at the entrance of the store. It's the first thing you see when you walk in. Beyond us is the rest of the pharmacy. There's also a cash register near the entrance, with a divider behind it. The divider's about 5-10 inches tall, but it doesn't connect to the wall, leaving this narrow gap that nobody really uses. That little detail is important later. One day, this guy walked into my department. I gave him the usual greeting. "Hi there, can I help you find anything?" He just stared at me and made a kind of grunt. He was Asian, and since we get a lot of new immigrants in the area, I thought maybe he didn't speak English. I told him to let me know if he needed help and went back to assisting other customers. But I kept an eye on him for loss prevention. At one point, I was standing near the cash register, gazing out the window. In my peripheral vision, I noticed him standing in that weird gap between the divider and the window. It's not a spot where customers usually linger. When I turned to look at him, he quickly ducked out of sight. That was when I realized he knew what he was doing was strange. I decided to act like I didn't notice and walked away from the register, hoping he'd move on. Instead, he followed me with his eyes, pretending to browse products whenever I looked his way. This went on for a while, a weird game of cat and mouse. Eventually, I had enough. At this point, I wasn't scared, just annoyed that I had to keep an eye on him. I told the manager on duty that he was making me uncomfortable. She brushed it off, saying he was probably waiting for a prescription. I went on break about 20 minutes later. Before I left, a coworker told me he'd hidden behind that same divider at least one more time. I warned the cashier to keep an eye on him just in case. When I came back, I saw him walking past me outside. I avoided eye contact and hurried inside. After my break, my coworker mentioned that he'd come back into the department while I was gone, looked around and left the store without buying anything. Knowing what I know now, he didn't purchase anything during his entire hour-plus stay. Oh, and apparently, while I was in the lunchroom, he kept walking past the store windows, peering inside, almost like he was looking for someone. Some of my coworkers thought he might have a developmental delay because he never spoke and acted oddly. At the time, I hoped that was the end of it. Spoiler, it wasn't. A few weeks later, I was working with my department manager. She knew all about the first incident. While I was busy with a task, I saw someone walk in and said my usual hello without looking up. When I glanced up, it was him. The moment he saw me, he locked eyes with me like the Terminator. He didn't say anything, just stared. He wandered off into the store, but I noticed him hovering at the end of an aisle, watching me. I called my manager out immediately. She's not the type to take crap from anyone. When I pointed him out, she went straight over and asked if she could help him. He didn't respond, just avoided her, and kept glancing at me whenever I wasn't looking. For 10 minutes, she stayed on him like a shadow. Finally, he gave up and left. My manager thought he might be pretending to have a disability to seem harmless. This was the scariest one. It was a Saturday, and I was at the register helping a customer. They mentioned the nice weather, and as they left, I looked out the window. That's when I saw him again, hiding behind a pillar outside the store, staring straight at me. I immediately called Monica, the manager from the first incident. She came running, along with 2 supervisors, Roberta and Carl. Monica stared him down from inside the store, but he ignored her and kept his eyes on me. She pretended to be on the phone, pointing at him as if she were calling the cops. He walked away, but a minute later, he was back, acting like nothing happened. Monica had had enough. She went outside and told him to leave or she'd call the police. He didn't respond, just stared at her emotionlessly, then turned around and walked to his car. That's when we all froze. He had a car. Up until then, we'd assumed he was on foot. It suddenly hit us that he might have driven all the way here just to watch me. That realization made the whole situation way more unsettling. Monica said he gave her the creeps, and for someone as tough as her, that's saying a lot. She was convinced he knew exactly what he was doing, and might have been pretending to be disabled to avoid suspicion. I haven't seen him since, and I hope it stays that way. But knowing he's out there, and that he might have been deliberately targeting me, that's a feeling I can't shake. This happened about 4 years ago when I was 20. The first time I met the man who would later become my grocery store stalker. He was standing outside collecting donations for the Salvation Army during Christmas time. I'm a friendly person and usually say hi to people at places I frequent. He looked about my age, very tall, at least 6'4", with a vacant expression that vaguely reminded me of Lurch from the Addams Family. He had dark circles under his eyes, short black hair, and an unsettling presence. We chatted for maybe 2 minutes about nothing in particular, weather, the holidays, and then I waved goodbye and went home. I thought nothing of it at the time, but that brief interaction would lead to months of fear. About 4 or 5 months later, I was grocery shopping with a friend when she suddenly went quiet, her expression shifting to discomfort as she stepped back. I turned to see the same man standing inches behind me. He greeted me like we were old friends, saying he remembered me from December, and then asked for my number. I was caught off guard and didn't know how to handle the situation. Trying to deflect, I told him I didn't have my number memorized, but would take his instead. As I pulled out my phone, I made a point to show him my wallpaper, a photo of my boyfriend, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. He gave me his number, and I immediately blocked it as soon as I walked away. But before I could leave, he leaned in uncomfortably close and said in a low voice, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." His tone sent chills down my spine. I forced a smile, mumbled something about needing to get back to shopping, and dragged my friend away. When I asked why she didn't help me out, she admitted he had scared her too. At 5'8" inches and solidly built, I don't intimidate easily, but he made me feel small and vulnerable. I hoped that would be the last I'd see of him, but it was only the beginning. After that encounter, he started appearing every time I went to the store. No matter which checkout lane I used, he'd show up at the end, staring. If I moved to a different section of the store, he'd eventually pop up nearby. Once, I even caught him following me out to my car. That's when I decided to report him to the managers. They assured me they'd tell him not to speak to me, but the stalking didn't stop. He stayed at a distance watching me, and it started to feel like he was everywhere I went in the store. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he just happened to be working in the areas I was shopping in, but when I started paying closer attention, it became clear he was deliberately following me. His persistence was terrifying, but I refused to stop shopping there out of fear. One evening, I went to grab a few items for dinner. I saw him standing outside the store as I arrived, his back to me, so I quickly slipped inside, hoping he hadn't noticed me. A few minutes later, I spotted him in the back of the store. I grabbed my items and rushed toward the front, ducking behind a shelf display to watch. He walked up and down the checkout lanes, searching for me. When he didn't see me, he stepped outside. I rang up my items as quickly as I could and peeked out the door. Not seeing him, I began walking toward my car, parked near a side lot with small stores and restaurants. As I neared my car, I saw him by the store entrance I had used earlier. I ducked behind a pillar, praying he hadn't seen me. I watched as he scanned the parking lot, looking for me. After a minute or two, he walked toward the front lot, and I seized the chance to run to my car. The moment I locked my doors, I looked up, and there he was. He stood about 15 feet away, holding a shopping cart, staring directly at me. It was clear he had followed me, and only grabbed the cart to make it look like he was working. My heart pounded as I drove away, terrified. When I got home, I broke down, crying and shaking, as I told my grandfather what had happened. He didn't hesitate. He told me to get in the car, and we drove straight to the store. He demanded to speak to the managers immediately, and I recounted everything while he made it clear they needed to handle the situation, or he'd involve the police. The managers promised to take care of it. While he wasn't fired immediately, my friend later told me she would occasionally see him when I wasn't there. However, whenever I was in the store, he avoided me entirely. Eventually, he disappeared for good. Whether he was fired or moved on, I'll never know, but I haven't seen him since. Even now, I get chills thinking about how closely he watched me, and how easily he could avoid or follow me whenever he wanted. That experience taught me to trust my instincts and not dismiss my discomfort as paranoia. I've never felt so afraid of another person as I did that day when he locked eyes with me in the parking lot. To my grocery store stalker, let's not meet again.